Hear Not My Steps by L.T.C. Rolt. It was a large gloomy room, and cold. Davies leant from his chair by the hearth and stirred the logs into a blaze, but neither the fire's light nor that of the candles which flickered and guttered in the draughts from ill-fitting doors and casements could dispel the shadows from the corners of the panelled walls or from the great four-poster bed with its faded hangings. He got up and for the fourth time made a thorough examination of the room. He found nothing unusual. The seals he had placed over doors and windows were intact, and no movable objects had been disturbed from the chalk rings he'd drawn around them. His thermograph recorded a slight fall in temperature, but no more than might be expected at the approach of midnight. He returned to his chair, yawned, and picked up the book he'd been reading. This business of psychical research upon which he'd embarked so enthusiastically was beginning to pall. In the past 2 years he'd kept similar vigil in 4 alleged haunted rooms in different parts of the country, from none of which, according to local superstition, he had any right to emerge alive. But no incident which, by any stretch of imagination, could be attributed to supernatural agency had rewarded his patience, discomfort, and loss of sleep. It looked as though this, his 5th experiment, was going to prove equally fruitless. No longer expectant, his eyelids drooped, and he must have dozed, for when he opened his eyes once more and glanced at his wristwatch, the hands pointed to midnight. He shivered involuntarily, and as he did so he became aware that, although the fire still burned brightly, the room had grown very cold. A glance at his thermograph confirmed this sensation, for it had recorded a fall of nearly 15 degrees since his last examination, little more than half an hour before. This was quite abnormal and quickened his flagging interest. He was about to make yet another tour of inspection when his attention was drawn to the shadows beside the bed. They appeared to be moving and thickening in a manner which the flickering of the candles did not explain. As he watched, a pale oval gradually distinguished itself from the gloom, about 6 feet from the floor. He soon realized that this was a face, and that he was witnessing the materialization of a phantom. At first the form was very indistinct, but though he heard no sound, it presently began to move, or rather to glide, very slowly away from the bed and towards his chair. As it did so, it became clearer, like an image brought into the focus of a glass. He saw that it was the figure of a man, clad in a cloak of some drab-coloured stuff which reached almost to his heels. The face was deathly pale, and the dark eyes, opened very wide, stared directly, not so much at him as through him. Davies was not a timid man, and the emotion he felt was one of pity and concern rather than fear. Though it seemed a strange term to apply to a ghost, he thought it was the most haunted face he'd ever seen. Terror and misery lurked in the eyes, but otherwise the features were expressionless, a mere mask, which the mind within, petrified by some intensity of emotion, could not, and would never again, animate. This impression only lasted a few moments, because the figure continued to advance, and as it did so it seemed to lose focus again, becoming once more immaterial and shadowy, until, though Davies thought it might be an illusion of the unsteady light, its shadow seemed to envelop him and to darken the outlines of the room. He glanced quickly behind him, but saw nothing, only his vision still seemed curiously blurred, and try as he would, he couldn't see anything clearly. Even the candle flames looked indistinct, surrounded by a wavering nimbus of light, as though his eyes were veiled by tears. While he was aware that he'd been vouchsafed an experience which most psychical investigators would envy him, the knowledge somehow failed to arouse in him any enthusiasm. This was due, perhaps, to the defect of vision which troubled him. Gradually, however, he found that his sight was clearing, until he could once more see the room quite plainly. Yet still he felt no reassurance, no return of critical interest. Instead, a great weight of undefinable depression seemed suddenly to have descended upon his spirit. Why, he thought, should we mortals struggle to discover what lies beyond the grave, when death will come to lift the veil for all of us so soon? What, after all, is the purpose of life, the point of human hopes and fears, ambitions, passions, and sorrows? Life is merely a series of distractions, which blind us to the one great reality, the reality of death's relentless and unconquerable quest. Dust hath closed Helen's eye. Yes, and worms have long since writhed through that flesh which was once so fair. Since this is my inescapable destiny also, why strive against it? Why reject the cool steel of Hamlet's bare bodkin, only to suffer the slow corruption of old age? What could have set him musing in a strain so foreign to his usually cheerful disposition? He put the sombre thoughts from him, struggling to assure himself of a friendly reality, like one who wakes from a nightmare. But he found that the task called for an immense effort of willpower. He forced himself to his feet, and began, like a man moving in a trance, to examine the room. He could find no trace of any of his seals, and the thermograph had vanished. Yet he could not bring himself to feel any surprise at their disappearance. He had no anticipation of finding them, for they had become the figments of a dream which was rapidly fading from his mind. The room, too, looked subtly different, although here again he could not believe with any conviction that it had ever looked otherwise. The oak of furniture and panelling looked lighter in colour. So did the elm-bordered floor, which had lost the wave-like undulations of age. When he looked at the bright hues of the bed-hangings, he wondered how he could ever have imagined that they were so old and faded. Somehow the sight of the bed filled him with an indescribable feeling of loathing and revulsion, so that he moved away hurriedly towards the window and looked out. In his dream, for a dream he was now convinced it was, he had gazed down upon a square of wasteland bordered by a row of tall poplars. But now a full moon showed him clearly that there were no poplars, and that the wasteland was, in fact, a garden of clipped yews and terraced walks. Had he ever regarded such a prospect with equanimity? Every yew must surely harbour in its grotesque shadow some hostile and malevolent shape. Nor was there any solace to be found in the stillness of the night, in the pallid moonlight, or even in the great star-pricked dome of the sky. Thou sure and firm-set earth, hear not my steps. The words of Macbeth echoed in his mind as he experienced a strange feeling of detachment. It was as though the dark globe were spinning beneath his feet, about to cast him out into the desolation of outer space. He gazed up at the sky. What if death were not, after all, an ultimate oblivion, but the prelude to an eternal suspense, lifeless yet deathless, in the cold and the dark of illimitable nothingness? His soul shrank from so desolate a conception, and, trembling, he moved back once more into the room. It looked bright in the light of the many tall candles which smoked in their sconces. He understood quite well now that horror lay concealed behind the hangings of the bed, yet an irresistible compulsion drew him there, and before he parted the curtains he knew what he would see. The woman's hair, fanning out over the pillow's whiteness, gleamed gold in the candlelight. She had been so beautiful, he remembered, whose only glory now lay in this hair. How quickly that beauty had been snuffed out! Where the roses and lilies so lately bloomed, now black corruption already crept. Who would beg a glance from eyes which had started from their sockets to stare so hideously? Or a kiss from lips drawn back to reveal the sharp teeth which had bitten through the protuberant tongue? On the coverlet lay a length of whipcord. He picked it up, running its taut length between his fingers. Then, very deliberately, he coiled it about his throat and drew it tight. As he did so, he realized what he was doing, but his hands continued to strain upon the cord until the sound of choking ceased, and it was very still in the room.